additional bit of something to eat before coming out and doing this program. It's gotten to be a tradition and a very comfortable routine. Harold and Tina, as Harold just mentioned, have been doing the programming for this club for about 20 years, which is pretty outstanding service to the group. Thanks. Because that's how this all works, right? I mean, everybody knows that. You folks who are new here, this is a volunteer organization. Nobody here is getting paid. They do this because they enjoy each other's company and they recognize the value in sharing information this way. You know, there are some things, if you want to learn how to do it, you're going to have to pay for a teacher and take lessons and what have you. And you may end up doing that in bonsai too. You can. That opportunity is there. But you have this other system in place, this club system, which is kind of an anachronism, you know, these kind of social organizations where people voluntarily come together to share an interest. That's not a strong part of our social fabric anymore. It's too bad because it's a very useful thing. And it's members like Harold and Tina, like the other officers who are now stepping down, Steve Zeisel. These people take time, and it's no easier for them than it would be for you, right? To step up and give time and give labor to keep this organization healthy. I'll tell you, as somebody who gets around and sees a fair number of these kind of groups, this is a very, very well-run organization. And it shows in your membership. I go and talk to clubs sometimes and there's 6 people in the audience, you know. And they've had the same president for 10 years. And there might be some relationship between those two facts. Right? So it's a good thing that your organization is as vibrant as it is, has the people who step up and contribute and carry the load for a little while, and has this mechanism that apparently works very, very well at bringing new people in through the door. You may or may not know what a challenging thing that is for one of these kind of social organizations, to keep new blood constantly flowing in. This is not just bonsai groups, it's other civic organizations, garden clubs, I speak to a lot of them, and predominantly the audience is older, right? And they're always hungry for new members. And they say, how do we get new members to come? Well, your club has found a pretty good solution to that. It seems to be, I'm here every year after the state fair, and there's always new folks who come from the state fair. They've seen the bonsai there, they enjoy it, they say, hey, check that out. They come to a meeting, maybe they never come back, especially, you know, they come to the November meeting. I don't take personal responsibility. You know, people sample things, right? You know that. You've probably done it yourself. It's like you get a passing interest. I'll look into that. I remember being a member of the Asheville Mushroom Club for one meeting. They hooked me in. They had a publication. It was I forget the name of it. The Asheville Mushroom Club newsletter or something. And then in small letters underneath it said, printed sporadically.
I didn't mention the expo.
That's all right.
What a great expo once again.
Yes. You know, the timing of this visit is interesting in a number of ways, and one of them is that it always follows the expo. And this was the 22nd Carolina Bonsai Expo at the North Carolina Arboretum in Asheville, if you hadn't heard of it or haven't been to one. 22nd year in a row that we did it. And your club has been a participating member from the very beginning. So this is one of the charter organizations of that show. And that show's done pretty well for itself. You know, we set attendance records this year. It's kind of a crapshoot to say how many people came, but thousands, you know, estimated 3,500 people on Saturday, and I don't know about Sunday, but it usually is about the same. Now here in Raleigh-Durham area, that might not sound like a whole lot of people, but that's the most people who come to the Arboretum for any weekend of the year.
Right.
And that's been an established thing now for a while. That's bonsai succeeding, you know, in a marketplace of sort. right? We put the bonsai out there, we say, hey, we're having a show, and people turn out to see it. And it works because organizations like yours pitch in, volunteer. And again, Harold and Gabriel and Steve and other people involved in it, they don't get paid to do that. Your club willingly participates, and I really appreciate it.
Don was our chairperson this year.
Did he get paid?
Was that supposed to?
He just got his pat on the back.
Our exhibit
Yes.
squeaks in with the...
Well, it was chosen as the Best in Show by our guest artist, Jack Sustick, who was curator of the U.S. National Arboretum Bonsai Collection, the National Collection, for 14 years, so you might suppose he knows what he's looking at. And he chose your group's display as the Best in Show this year, so congratulations
Thanks,
to
Don.
you.
All right.
So another aspect of coming to see you at this time of year, it's very pleasant driving across the state and seeing all the autumn leaves. It's a very colorful ride here today. But it's also kind of a nostalgic time of year, right? This change of seasons, you're watching the growing season come to a close, get this pretty show, and you know what comes next? The trees will be bare for the next 5-6 months. It's all fine, we anticipate it, but still when you're in that transition season and you're seeing the old go away, it's hard not to have some feelings of melancholy or nostalgia. And I had plenty of time, right? Just driving down the road, think about these things. And I was thinking about the 22nd Expo, the 23rd time I'm coming to talk to your club. And as it happens, Jeff in the back there is one of those terrible people who keeps notes. And he came up to me just a few minutes ago and showed me notes that he took from that 1995 meeting. Right? He said, hope they don't get this guy back again. But in his notes, he said I was talking about the collection, which at that time was a pretty nascent entity. We started with bonsai at the Arboretum in 1992, just about this time of year. It was actually election night, 1992, when I and another member of the Arboretum staff drove out to Butner, North Carolina, to bring back the collection that had been donated to us, which was the start of our bonsai efforts. All right, so some of this is very repetitive to people like Jim, who's been sitting there for 23 years now, waiting for something new. But for those of you who are new here to this club and maybe don't know about the Arboretum in Nashville and the bonsai collection there, that was our start. We got a donation of a private individual's collection. And this person was an elderly woman. She had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and her family, didn't want the responsibility for their mom's trees, didn't know who to turn to, and by accident, it was just a serendipitous thing, somebody from their family spoke on the phone to somebody who worked at the Arboretum, and it was just a connection that was made out of thin air. And they said, oh, by the way, our mother has these really expensive, fancy little plants, and she's not going to be around very long, and we want something to do with them. We'd hate anything bad to happen to them. Can you think your Arboretum would be interested? And we were so new then, so new, that those of you who are familiar with the Arboretum, let me tell you, if you were there for the expo, say, if you were to transport yourself, if you were to stand out in front of the education center where the exhibit was held and transport yourself back to 1992, well, you'd fall down from the shock, right? Because the only thing of all that you could see from that vantage point, the only thing that was there in 1992 was that big building, the education center. There was no parking lot, there were no gardens, there were no trails. There was basically nothing but this massive empty building sitting out in the middle of the forest. And nobody came unless they were lost. It's no joke. The first couple of years I worked there, I started there in 1990. So the first couple of years I worked there, the only people we saw were people who were lost trying to find Lake Powhatan, which is the national recreation area down the road from us. They drive up, we say, hey, how you doing? You know, it's like a shock to see people. Where's Lake Powhatan? We say, oh, yeah, down the road a couple more miles. And that was where we were at. And then here's this offer for a bonsai collection. And because we were at that stage, it was kind of like, yeah, sure, we'll look into that, right?
We'll figure it out.
Not me. I didn't have anything to do with it. The boss went there with some members of the local bonsai club and a fellow named John Creech, who I won't even start talking about because if you don't know who he was, I don't have the time to tell you. But he was a really important and good fellow. And they all went down to look at this bonsai collection. Now, our director didn't have any idea about bonsai at all. Dr. Creech had a pretty good idea. And the local club members, they did too, and they were all really enthusiastic. They said, yeah, you should take this. So he said, well, I got to run it by our board. This is our director talking. He says, I have to run this by our board before we make a decision. Do you mind if we take some of the plants back to Asheville and put them out on display for our next board meeting so the board members can see what these are and see if we want to get involved? And the family was very reluctant. They wanted assurances that the plants would come back quickly and no damage and so forth. And they allowed it to happen. So about 15 of them came back to the Arboretum and were set up. And the board came and looked at them and said, yeah, sure, why not? Because there was nothing else. The place was empty. Nobody was coming. It was a feeling like, well, we got to have something, right? People have to have something to look at. We have no gardens. They got to have something to look at. So let's take on these strange plants and see how it goes. Right? So that's how we started. I'm bothering to bore people who've heard this before with another retelling, just because I want to set up what I aim to talk about today. All right?
How
Yes,
many
sir.
of those original plants do you still have?
Quite a few. I would say like 90% of our tropical holdings are still from that first donation.
Cool.
And it's pretty much the normal course of events that, one, you lose plants along the way. Hate to say it, but those of you who are just starting, you'll find out soon enough, right? You lose plants along the way. Sometimes it's because you make mistakes, right? You do the wrong thing at the wrong time or whatever, and you forget that your tropical can't be out when it's going to be a frosty night. Things happen. But then other things happen that you have no control over. And sometimes you don't even know why it happened. One day you're looking at your plant and you say, it doesn't look so good, and the next day it looks worse, and then the week after that it's dropping leaves, and the next thing you know, you're bringing it to the club and saying, whoa, what happened? And they look at it and say, well, you got yourself a new pot. So these kind of things happen for us too. And I couldn't say exactly how many of those remain, but a fair number of them do. The tropicals, plus a fair number of temperate plants. And guess what? After 25 years, they're really starting to look pretty good. By the time they came to us, a lot of them were in bad health. Actually, a lot of them died before they came to us. The woman couldn't let go of them. She loved them so well, even though she couldn't take care of them, she couldn't see them go. And so by the time they came to us, a lot of them were gone already, or badly damaged, or overgrown, and what have you. So that was the situation back then. 93 would be like the first year I was actively involved with the collection, right? And at that point, I knew nothing. Nothing. Those of you who are just walking into your first meeting, I knew less than you know. No, that's no joke. That's the truth. I hadn't even seen the Karate Kid movie. I didn't know anything about it. Not the first thing. I didn't even know if I liked them. And the first ones I saw were not in the best shape, so I thought, oh, these things look kind of sickly, They should be bumped up into bigger pots. For one thing, why? They got them stuffed in these little pots. They're always cutting on them. No wonder they look so bad. That's not a joke. That's how I was thinking. That's how I came to it. And then, it was given to me as a responsibility. Oh, great, I don't know anything. The plants are not in great shape. And Asheville now has at least some reputation for being a good bonsai reference, you know, a good center for bonsai in the region. But it wasn't back then. The local club was fairly anemic. That's one of those clubs, I've talked to them when they had a half a dozen members. They're doing better now, thank goodness, but you know, they up and down like most organizations do. And at that point, they were not robust. So it was like, okay, here are these strange plants, and I'm supposed to take care of them, and I don't know anything about them. Unfortunately, this is where that fellow Dr. Creech comes in. I got sent out to a variety of places to learn. Right? Great learning opportunities thanks to the Arboretum. Of all of them, and there were some nice ones, the learning period opportunity that I value the most was one weekend I got to spend with Yuji Yoshimura in upstate New York at his house. Now, enough time has passed since Mr. Yoshimura died that perhaps, you know, a lot of you don't know who he is. But at one point, he was the main guy in American bonsai, right? And then for a longer period of time, it was him and John Naka, with Yuji kind of being the East Coast guru and John Naka kind of being the West Coast guru, and they both traveled back and forth. But you know, it broke into kind of like camps, right? And Yuji he was born into a bonsai family in Japan. He was the eldest son of a man who was a bonsai professional, a very highly respected bonsai professional in Japan, and he left. He left. He was to inherit the business, you know, they're still very traditional that way. Eldest son, he was going to inherit the family business, and he left to come to America and teach Westerners, including women. Oh, it wasn't funny. He was ostracized. I didn't learn this till later, but that was a shameful thing he did. He left the family business to go teach bonsai to Westerners. Nobody did that. Nobody did that. He did that. He came here, set up shop just north of New York City. Tarrytown was his first place, and then he moved to Briarcliff Manor, which is close by. And from there, that was his home base. He traveled all over the United States, all the way to the West Coast. He was teaching in California before John Naka was, right? And he traveled everywhere and helped establish bonsai clubs and taught countless thousands of people. And as luck had it, fate had it, or whatever, when I went to study with him in January of 1995, I turned out to be his last student. I went there and I heard so many things about him. I was scared. Honest to goodness. He had a reputation, and you can vouch for this, as being somebody who wasn't concerned about your feelings, who had very strong opinions and would, you know, tell you all about them, and was a kind of dictator. You know, he knew and you didn't, so do what I tell you. That was his kind of mentality. And I heard all these things in bits and pieces before I was to go. It came to me like bad vibes on the air, you know. It's like, oh, Yoshimura, you're gonna good luck with that. And I was really afraid when I went. And
so you did him in.
He was shockingly old when he opened his door. I had actually met him once or twice before, but I saw him in a public venue where he was the great Yoshimura. It was at the World Bonsai Convention in Orlando in 1993, I think that was. And he was the headliner, him and John Naka, right? They were the big cheeses, and some people from Japan. And I, through another involved process I won't describe, I was able to get an invitation from him to come and study with him at his place. And I arrived at the door, and he opens the door, and it's not, you know, the vibrant Mr. Yoshimura in his official kimono from Japan. He would wear a black kimono, and he was on stage, you know, and he wouldn't talk and stuff. He was very strict, colorful but strict. And instead, this old bent man opened the door. So feeble looking, I couldn't believe it. And invited me in. And the 3 days I spent studying with him changed everything for me. Everything. And it all had to do with this stuff, right? Because that's what I was there to learn. It was to learn bonsai. I was a young, back then, young person who was given this responsibility and in no way measured up to it. Did not know what I was doing. And he recognized that. I'm sure he recognized that in a matter of moments, right? And I brought along pictures of our trees, and I was shaking when I showed them to him, and he would, that was it. It was grunts, and I thought, oh, this is going to be so bad. It wasn't bad. It was very good. And because in that time we spent together, the conversation went well beyond bonsai, and a lot of very memorable personal moments. But the big thing he gave me in bonsai was this. He was acutely aware of the responsibility of being the curator of a public collection. He said, your responsibility, beyond keeping the trees looking good, keeping the collection alive, your responsibility is to help bonsai find a new audience. You have to figure out a way to make bonsai more interesting to ordinary everyday people. Because you're going to have the opportunity to do that because your collection is public. The trees that you do and work on, they're going to be seen by many, many people. And with that comes a responsibility to try to engage them, to show them bonsai in a way that will have some personal connection for them, to bring more people in. Just like your club has to do that, right? You have to always be thinking about bringing new people in so you can keep going, right? Because it gets better the more people you have engaged. And the same way with bonsai, in a larger sense. In order for it to continue progressing, continue being viable, to become something it isn't at present, it has to keep bringing new people in. It has to keep finding new audience. And he said, it was my job to do that. Now, bear in mind, my level of experience. I didn't know how to prune a tree. And he's telling me, well, you have to figure out a way to engage the public. And I kind of thought he was joking, because it seemed completely absurd on the face of it. And he had a wicked kind of sense of humor. He would, like yank your leg, and when it came off and you realized it was a joke, then he would crack a smile. So I thought this was a joke. And I chuckled a little bit. He said, no joke! In my face! Like the way I remembered, he was like jumping over the table at me. I don't think he did, because he wasn't physically capable. But, it stood me up straight. He said, no joke. That's your responsibility. You need to create, and these were his exact words here. I'm not paraphrasing. He said, you need to create the Carolina School of Bonsai. And now I thought, this is completely crazy. I don't even know what he's talking about. I just want to learn how to make portable trees. You have to invent the Carolina School of Bonsai. Okay, I'll do my best. And it kind of, went on from there, our conversation. But that stuck in my head. And partly I was thinking like, yeah, he's losing it, He's been around too long and it's starting to go on him, right? Because he can't seriously think that's something I'm responsible for. Over time, that kind of mandate has continually come back to me. And as it turned out, his words were prophetic in a way. Not to claim that I've invented the Carolina School of Bonsai. I would never call it that, for one thing. But the Arboretum's collection has become known now as, for many people, this is the way that they frame it. They say, well, they do a lot of work with native plants there, which is true. Right? Both of these are native plants. This is common red maple, grows all over the place, right? You can have as many of these as you want. All you have to do is find a big one, and there'll be lots of little ones in the immediate area. This is American elm. Not so easy to find anymore. It used to be a very, very common tree in America. But wiped out by an introduced pathogen, Dutch elm disease. But these are American elms, and as bonsai, you can control that fungal problem pretty easily. You know, a 60-foot tree, 75-foot tree, very difficult to deal with a fungal problem. But at this level, they're completely dependable, right? So native plant material, we do that, and people have kind of hung our identity on that hook. Oh yeah, that's the one that has all the native plant material. We do, but we also have all the other kinds of things like you'd expect: Japanese black pine, Japanese white pine, trident maples, Japanese maples, Chinese elms, Stewardias, all the traditional things, we have them too. But the thing is that a lot of our trees don't look the way that people think of bonsai looking. You know, we all walk around with our own images of everything, right? It's like an essence of, right? So if I say dog, you can all conjure up mentally an image of a dog. Maybe it's a dog you own. Maybe it's a dog that bit you when you were a kid. Maybe it's a dog that you saw in a movie one time. But you all have some image in your mind of dog. And it could be better informed or lesser informed. You all also have an image of bonsai in your mind. When somebody says bonsai, whether you're conscious of it or not, you're visualizing that thing. What do you see? Right? And for the average person in the public, their response would be like mine was the first time I was asked by the boss when he was going to give me this job. He said, "Do you know what bonsai are?" And I said, "Yeah, those are those strange little Japanese trees." And he said, "That's right. That's how most people think of bonsai. Not necessarily you, because you've all stepped past that point, right? You're interested enough to come out and take part in this organization and learn more and study and go see shows and all the rest of it. But for the average person out there, you say bonsai, that's what they think. They think those little Japanese trees in the fancy pots. Know what happens when people think that first? A big, big, big chunk of the potential audience goes, because they know they don't want that. They don't really actually know what it is, but they know they don't want that. I was in a similar kind of position myself, because when the job was offered to me the first time, I refused it. How would you like to be responsible for those trees? Yeah, not very much. Seriously, that was my response. And it was only when the boss did a little arm twisting and said, "Well, you know, it might be a career opportunity." And I was thinking, yeah, career opportunity, right? Little trees, my future. I didn't think that was very inviting. But, you know, as a practical matter, when your boss starts talking to you about career opportunities, you better be paying attention. So I said, yeah, I would do it. And I said, but I'd like to just do it like in my free time, because I like what I'm doing now and I'd like to keep doing that. And he said, no problem. Because neither one of us knew what we were talking about. Right? Little Japanese trees, how big a deal could it be? Really. All right, so I go to Mr. Yoshimura to learn how, and instead he fills my head with this kind of nonsense. And down the line, it starts to fall into place and make sense too. As I go out and engage more bonsai, see more bonsai, and what do I see? I come to clubs like this and listen to the talk of the members, and it all is referencing Japan. Go to a bonsai show, what do you see? You see trees set up in a way that imitates the Japanese tokonoma displays. Go to a bonsai shop, you know, if you could find one. Go to a bonsai shop, you walk in, what do you see? You see scrolls for sale, you see all this kind of Asian accoutrement that you can buy to take home with your bonsai so that you got the official stuff that you need to do it, right? And then I meet bonsai people like Felton Jones, great member of this club, right? Maybe founding member of this club?
Charlotte.
Okay, he was bonsai pioneer in the Southeast, Felton Jones. And he was completely that way. He just about worshipped Japanese culture. in my memory of them. It was all exquisite, refined. You had to spend your life studying it just so you could get the smallest little bit of understanding of it, you know? And the same way with bonsai. You know, 20, 30 years, you might just be cracking the egg a little bit, you know? And if you stick with it, you'll get there one day, in some life down the line.
Yeah.
Well, it's fine. There are many people for whom all that is wonderful. They love that. They love it. And they love bonsai, and they enjoy it, and they share their love with other people who are interested. But again, that represents a really thin slice of the pie. If you're talking about the pie of public interest, right, which has something of relevance to me in my work, if I do bonsai in a way that the public doesn't engage with, how long will I have a job? Mr. Yoshimura recognized that, you know, before I did, long before I did. I just felt like, yeah, well, there's apparently an audience for this, you do it and they'll come. But that's not true. When you look around at other bonsai collections, public collections in the country, you can count on the fingers of one hand how many of them do as well as the exhibit in Asheville, right? Many of the bonsai public collections are not strong. They're not a strong component of the garden that houses them because it's a specialty thing, right? It's this little demographic over here, the people who really and truly love Japanese culture. They're great people, great culture. Nothing wrong with any of that. But that's not where most people are at. They picture that little funny triangular shaped Japanese tree in the fancy pot and it's like, yeah, those are fine, you know. I saw guys selling them off the side of the highway. And that's the level of engagement you get. And then they're on to something else. My job to make bonsai something that ordinary people would find interesting. How do you do that? Well, I asked myself that for years. How do you do that? You know? Meanwhile, it's learning how to make the little triangular-shaped Japanese trees, right? Because you've got to do that first. Got to figure that out. So while working on that, always in the back of my mind, this idea about how do you make bonsai more engaging for everyday people? People who are not inclined that way to begin with, people who are not fascinated with exotic culture. How do you make bonsai interesting to them? And it turned out the answer was really, really simple. Really simple. You redirect what the focus is away from the fascination with a foreign culture and toward what bonsai truly represents, which is nature, personal experience of nature. Everybody has that. Everybody. Now there are people who live in penthouses in places that you and I would never want to live in, who don't see trees on a regular basis, who think of them as foreign objects, you know. But for most of us, trees and nature in general is an everyday and very welcome, even necessary part of our life, right? When you get stressed, let's go take a walk in the woods. Let's go to the park. Let's do something that puts us back out there and reconnects us with the natural world. Because most of us have a very positive response to that. It rejuvenates us. It always has. Every art form you can think of traces its roots back to the human experience of nature. Every one. Dance, music, sculpture, poetry, all of them. Where did their beginnings come? Came from the feeling that we get being in the natural world, experiencing it, trying to communicate some of that. What are the oldest known paintings in the world? They're those paintings of animals on the walls of the caves in France, right? By our Neanderthal, I shouldn't say that because I don't know if Neanderthals live in, but our long ago ancestors, even them, who had to live in fear of those things. That was still what they chose to represent with their art. In bonsai, we have this really neat device where, what are we talking about? We're talking about trees. How do we talk about them? We talk about them through trees. Not always trees, sometimes vines, sometimes shrubs, And not always are we representing just trees. Sometimes we're representing shrubs. Sometimes we're just, appreciating a flowering plant in a pot. But for most of our purposes, we're talking about trees, the image of trees, and all that means to human beings, and we're using trees as our medium to express our own thoughts about trees to other people. Yes, well, this here, as I said, American elm. When I was working at the Arboretum before the bonsai came, I was in the nursery operation and working on the grounds and gardens and such. Well, there were no gardens. I was on the grounds and working in the nursery. And we produced many, many native woody plants grown from seed. And some of these became available to me as I was casting about for something to work with, to try to get up to speed, get some practice in. There were these excess plants in the nursery. And I asked, can I use some of them? And they said, sure. And then they got upset when I cut them all up. But they were there, and I was able to take advantage of them. There was an American elm that we had grown from seed, and I tried to make a formal upright out of it. And at that point, I was doing it, out of the book, literally. Read the book at night, go in the next morning and try to, do what I had been reading about. So I read about formal upright style, right? You take an elm and cut it off, and then sprouts come out, and you shape those sprouts. Well, sometimes it works that way, and sometimes it doesn't, right? And I found that out first thing. Sometimes it doesn't work so neatly. But I kept working with it, struggling with it, and I finally built something that looked kind of tree-like, and I got it into a bonsai pot, but it was always dissatisfying. It always looked wrong somehow. I'd look at it and say, what's wrong with that tree, I gave it its shape, and its shape is wrong. What did I do wrong? And I'd look in the book again, What? I got a first branch. I got my second branch a little bit higher up into the opposite side. I got a back branch, and I'm following the pattern of the tree. How come my tree is not good in my eyes? And I realized one day I was looking at it, I said, well, because it doesn't really look like a tree. It is a tree, but it doesn't look like one. It looks like a caricature, Like if I were to draw a picture of Harold, right? I would exaggerate certain things and do it real quick and loose, and then there's Harold, right? But if Harold sat next to me, you'd say, that's not quite Harold, It's kind of like an interpretation of Harold, and it's a little wrong in certain places. Yeah, that's how this tree was. It was like, I recognize it's supposed to be a tree, but it doesn't really look like one. Well, what I wound up doing with that was air layering the branches, right? Those of you who don't know what an air layer is, you'll find out soon enough. It's a very convenient way to make new material to work on, right? If you want to get things that you can work on, you don't want to start with all just little seedlings, you can take a branch like this that maybe has a little shape and development in it, and you can actually force it to grow roots of its own and then sever it and grow it in its own pot. Right? And then you've got this little head start on a nice tree. And I did that and took off four branches that were about like this, as I remember it. So I took the big tree that wasn't satisfying, and I took off 4 of the branches, and I put that unsatisfying tree in the compost pile so it could be on its way to the next incarnation. And then I took those 4, and 3 of them I put in pots and grew separately, and the 4th one I put in the ground, right? These are the 3 that went into the pots. This one was a little bit bigger to begin with, and I grew it more aggressively, right? Gave it more room to spread out, let it keep more of its stuff as I was developing it, right? Everything to favor its growth and development. The other 2 I kind of rode the brake on, developed them, but didn't allow them to get a whole lot bigger. They will get bigger anyway. As time goes by, even though you don't see it necessarily until you look at an old photo and you recognize, oh, look how much bigger that is. It does happen, even in a pot, just much slower. Over time, you'll build up trunk size and branch development, hopefully, right? And then the day came when I thought, put them together now into a group. and this is the group. Okay, as I was growing them, my idea about how to shape them was evolving, was changing. And what I started to do, maybe unconsciously at first and then very consciously, was to stop going back to the same reference points, which was book in the magazine. I can't tell you how many hours I would spend at night after work, laying in bed, looking at these pictures. Most of the books were written in Japanese. I couldn't tell what they said anyway. I was just looking at images, right? Studying how these things were built and then trying to copy it. And I stopped doing that. I started looking less and less, right? Not like, oh, get me away from me, evil thing. No, it was more like, God, that's getting tired. I'm not so interested in that anymore. What am I interested in? Hey, I step outside and there's a tree. I look at it. You know what? I've been looking at that tree for years. It's still interesting to me. I must like trees. I go out and look around. Look at them. They're everywhere, right? Even the young ones show us something. They all have something to teach you about how they grow, about how they look. You're out walking in the park or whatever, you see a tree, and you say, man, that's a nice-looking tree. Stop right there. Why is it a nice-looking tree? What makes it interesting, right? What about that tree drew your attention? If you can identify that, then there's a chance that when you go back and do your bonsai work, you can get a little bit of that into your tree, right? Instead of when you reach the point where there's decisions to be made, you think, yeah, what did that picture in the magazine show? Oh yeah, you do this. When you do it that way, it's like cooking from the cookbook. Nothing wrong with cooking from the cookbook. Most of us can't cook otherwise, right? Tell me how to do it. Give me step by step by step, and I can do it. But here, you close the cookbook, and you go on experience. This is what I like. This is what I don't like. Works both ways. You go out and you see a tree, and you say, man, that's an ugly tree. Why is it ugly? What makes it ugly? How come you enjoy looking at that one and not at that one? And when you stop and think about these things, you suddenly find that many of the reference points that you're taught in bonsai, how to shape trees, actually relate to that same thing. It relates to composition, right? It relates to how the different elements of the tree come together to create the image that they do. And so you come to realize, well, why don't I want opposite branches? I can see opposite branches of trees out in the woods all the time. Why don't I want them? Well, because when you have one, it's hard not to look right at the intersection. Your eye keeps getting stuck there. So it creates a static part of a composition that's supposed to be dynamic. Oh, so there's a reason for that rule. It's not like you do it because it's a rule. It's a rule because there was good sense in it. And when you start flipping it like that and seeing it from the other side, then you realize, like, oh, a lot of that stuff is very useful. We don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. There's a lot of really good information in the way that we typically learn bonsai. But there are places where you can say, I know that's how it's supposed to be done, but I think I might like to try it this way. Or I saw a tree that had this, which is definitely wrong from a bonsai point of view, but as a tree it looked really great. Let me see if I can do that in the bonsai. This tree, this arrangement, all of the trees, are grown just that way. Grown just that way. I'm a little reluctant because, there are new people here, and I don't want to poison you. You're just starting out. I give you these bad ideas, and then all the subsequent guests to the club will have to fix them. All right? But I'm going to tell you anyway, because it's all I know anymore. I come here, I sing the same song every year, right? That's why, like Steve's not here and Ed's not here. It's like, oh, him again? It's going to be about naturalism, right? My last two programs here were slideshow programs about naturalism. Well, here it is in the flesh, acted out. Why is this naturalism? Because the way these are shaped, the way they're arranged, is drawn from personal experience. It's crossbred with all that formal learning, but It also has to do with my own observation about how trees grow. How do trees grow? What is the main principle behind every tree growing out there in terms of how it shapes itself? Does it shape itself? Yes?
To be most advantageous to the sun.
That's exactly right. To put it more simply and not use big words like advantageous, wow, great. Trees grow to the sun to the extent that they can. Why do they do that? Well, because they need the sun as part of the biological process that keeps them alive. They have to have access to the sun. If they don't have that, they grow weak, which makes them more susceptible to insects and disease, or they fail altogether. They have to have their place in the sun. What happens when trees grow together? They race up. They race up. Because the one who gets up first gets the leg up on the others, right? You get sun, you live. You don't get sun, you die. Now, they don't think of it like that, right? But that is exactly how they're operating. Trees, plants in general, are less sophisticated organisms than we are. We walk around thinking about things and having feelings and such, and changing our mind and getting upset about stuff. Trees don't do any of that. They don't have the capacity to do that. Well, the question I get asked by lots of non-bonsai people, doesn't that hurt them? I don't know. I don't think so. If it does, they can't tell me about it. If it does, it must work on some principle other than our system. We have a central nervous system. Trees don't have that. Right? They are simpler organisms. And so the way they operate is simpler. And one of the basic tenets of their survival is get sun. Another one, get moisture. Right? What are the roots doing? They're seeking moisture. Always. That's why they grow. They grow to get more moisture. They grow upwards above the ground to get more sun. A big tree falls on another tree, breaks it down. Is that the end? Possibly, but possibly not. Now, some part of it, all right, here's the tree, right? That big tree falls on it, does this. All right? This part is done. This part that's aiming down to the ground has very little hope. This part, which used to be a branch, is now going up. Guess what it'll do? It'll take over as the new top. It'll start growing that way because it has the best chance of getting to the sun. This other part that used to be the top, it might hang on. Parts from it might start growing up too. The new up, right? There's a new up in town. And the one that has the best location to take advantage of it, it takes off and becomes the new leader of the tree. And this principle plays out in large and small ways over and over and over and over again throughout the tree's life. Look at a young tree. What does it look like? It looks like a stick coming out of the ground with a green mass on it, right? Young trees look similar to the way children draw trees, like lollipops, right? That's a young tree. Think about a young person, a young human being. What do they look like? Did they have wrinkles? Did they have gray hair? Did they walk stooped over? Did they complain about their aches and pains? No. They haven't had anything to complain about yet, right? They're young, they're strong, they're vibrant, they're growing up, right? Like a young tree. And then as life goes on, adversity comes to the tree. It can come in so many different ways, right? The big tree falls on the little tree, snow load, ice, wind damage from a hurricane, maybe just bad luck, right? You grew up next to the power line. You get to a certain point and they start taking limbs off of you, right? Stuff happens to them. And what do? They respond to it. How do they respond? They reorient themselves to continue the life process that has to go on if they are to live. That is, they go to the sun. Always. They fall down this way on the hillside, what do? They start growing up. They get beat down again, they grow up again. Constantly. Never end until the tree's dead. What is the end result of all that? Branches that look like this. Branches that do all kinds of stuff. No, they don't just all go out like this. They don't tilt downward because they're old. Right? That's the way I was taught. You want to make a branch look old? You bend it down. That makes it look old. It's like, well, okay. There's an old tree over there. It's doing this. How come it's not doing that? Well, because this is like a caricature. It's a thumbnail sketch. It's like, yeah, sometimes trees, because they're carrying all that weight out there, it brings the limbs down. So they angle downward instead of angling upward. It's true, they do that sometimes. And sometimes they do stuff like that. Why do they do that? Because they broke, and then they regrew, and then they broke again, and they regrew, and it just goes on for however long the tree's alive. Decades, right? And the really, really old trees you see, 1,000 years old, you can see them here in North Carolina. You just got to go look at the bald cypresses down at the coast. 1,000-year-old trees. And you look at them, and the bole of the tree, the trunk might be straight, maybe, but when you get up to the top, all the limbs are just going crazy because they're struggling to live. Life keeps throwing stuff at them, and they keep taking it and trying to make it, right? And some don't, and that's why we revere the old ones when we see them. Oh, look at that thing. Imagine what it's lived through. You know, how many hurricanes tore that thing apart, and there it still is, alive and struggling. This is a key element to what makes bonsai fascinating. If you can capture a little bit of that, that story never gets old. All living things respond to that story, especially us thinking ones, the ones with feelings and all that. We see something that talks about the struggle to live and the adversity that you face in everyday life and how it shapes you over the course of time, and there's a tree that tells you that story. And you can relate to it intimately. And the older you get, the more resonance that story has, because the more truth of it is revealed to you, right? When you're young. Why does bonsai appeal mostly to older people?
Looks like that.
You can relate to it. Yeah, you can relate more and more to it. Plus, it takes a long time, and young people don't have any time. Funny, older people, they're reaching actually the end of their license, right? Not to get personal or anything, but we're all running on a shorter lead than we used to have, right? And now bonsai becomes more and more interesting. Young people who have all the time in the world, except for the random crazy ones, they're not so keen on bonsai. It's like, yeah, it's kind of interesting, but I hear it takes years. So,
What
this.
happened to the fourth tree?
The fourth tree went in the ground, and I just dug it up 2 years ago. It has a trunk this big.
Wow.
No joke. Now, to make it that big, I had to let it grow, right? That's how it works. When you put a plant in the ground, it's kind of like you surrender the level of control you have when it's in a pot, and in return you get more growth. And with more growth comes more development. Typically in the trunk. When you put a plant in the ground, that's primarily what you're concerned about, is building a bigger trunk, right? And then when you go to collect it, you're going to cut most of the branches either off or shorten them dramatically, take it out of the ground, introduce it to container culture again, which is a big life change for a tree, and then assuming that it goes well, then you start working on branching, right? First primary branching, then secondary branching, finally ramification. And it's a process. Well, because I let that one grow unrestrained, when I went to collect it, I had to cut roots like this big. And then as a result, the tree really went into crisis mode. And big chunks of it died, right? Which in the past I would have looked at and said, oh, it's terrible, look what I did to that tree, I ruined it. And instead, now the way I look at it, it's like, wow, that's going to be really interesting, right? Because it didn't kill it. It didn't kill it. It really damaged it, right? So again, if you're worried about the plants having feelings,